when we rush to forgive somebody without feeling it, I call it faux-giveness. F-A-U-X, fake. It is faux-giveness. And I actually wrote an article for Spirituality and Health magazine about the dangers of faux-giveness, because when we are forgiving and we don't feel the forgiveness, we are out of alignment with our own integrity. And there are physiological responses that happen.
2, 1, 0.
Hi, and welcome to Stellar Life Podcast. This is your host, Orion. Today I have with me Stephanie Sarazin. She is a writer, researcher, and ambiguous grief guide who aims to help others grieving the loss of a loved one who is still living, but no longer as they once were. Her work began with her own experience of loss, which sparked an ambiguous journey, spirituality, and around the world to understand, name, and heal the grief she found within her. Her efforts reveal the first of its kind definition for ambiguous grief. Stephanie's work brings new resources to reframe disruptive activating event as a gateway to discovering your higher self, in turn championing ambiguous grief as natural and navigatable. Her book, Soulbroken, a guidebook for your journey through ambiguous grief, is the 2023 Nautilus Book Award Gold winner. In this episode, we talked about the grief of losing a friend, the grief of losing an intimate partner to divorce or a breakup, and what is the definition of ambiguous grief. We spoke about forgiveness and how it can be premature or how forgiveness is not for everyone. And toward the end, Stephanie beautifully held space for me as I expressed my own grief and just held space when I was tearing up. She was so beautiful. It was very emotional for me and actually quite healing. I think she's outstanding and phenomenal. And I really hope that this episode will be moving for you, helping you move forward, and be a healing one for you. And now, without further ado, on to the show. Hi, Stephanie, and welcome to Stellar Life Podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, Orion. Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you today.
Yeah, me too. Before we dive in, can you share a little bit about yourself and your origin story?
Oh, sure. I mean, you know what's interesting when you say that is we have so many origin stories, don't we? In life, depending on, who's asking or where we are. That's a really fun question. So for me, I'm a grief educator and writer and author focusing on the experience of ambiguous grief. I think probably for your listeners today, that's a good place to start my origin story. And, this isn't anywhere I thought I would be, Orion. I've yet to meet a child who wants to grow up to be working in the grief space, right? And it isn't really a conversation starter at dinner parties or, social events. Grief is something that I have come to engage with, not by choice, which is, I find true for so many of us. And yet it is a universal human experience. And so over the last 7 years, I've come to work in grief, in the grief space, and work with people going through grieving experiences. And it's really become such an important part of my life. For me, it didn't begin with the physical death of anybody I loved. It was the death of my marriage that I didn't see coming. It was a marriage I loved. And so in my own desire to feel better and understand my own emotions, I started reading whatever I could find and listening to anybody who was talking about it, because I knew that I was grieving the loss of this marriage, I recognized that it was different than grief I had experienced before when a loved one had died a physical death. And so that started me out on my experience of really unpacking what it is that we experience when we suffer a grief, but the person has not died a physical death. I felt, and I say this with the most reverence and respect for widows, because having worked with people who have experienced the death of their spouse, it is heart-wrenching. And I did not experience a physical death of my spouse. Yet I felt like I had lost that person and the relationship, and nobody was kind of comforting me like the widow I felt I was, right? I was also grieving my spouse and grieving a marriage, but there were no casseroles coming over Orion. There were no opportunities for me to, no societal norms for me to engage that allowed me to express my grief and have my grief witnessed. And so in trying to kind of understand how I was feeling so that I could feel better, I started myself on this journey to understand ambiguous grief. And now I help others understand it and work with it.
Right. What is your definition of ambiguous grief?
Sure. It's the grief experienced with the loss of a loved one who is still living, marked by hope. And, hope is a really interesting outlier that I found in this experience, because when our loved ones die a physical death, we understand that. We all understand we are mortal and we are going to one day die. And so when that happens, our minds don't look for a way to believe that the loved one we're grieving is going to ring our doorbell or, call or send a text. But when we're experiencing ambiguous grief and our person is still living, our brains begin to look for opportunities, narratives that have us hoping for a reunion or reconciliation. And so once I understood that hope presents in ambiguous grief the way it doesn't present with physical death, that was a game changer. Because once we know what it is and how to identify this kind of hope, we can offer ourselves compassion and work with our grief in a different way.
Right. So the two things you mentioned is, one, nobody witnessed your grief when you are separated, when you lose a relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship or an intimate relationship with a best friend, and there is a grieving process for that. And the second thing you said is that the hope is tormenting the one who's experienced that grief. Right, it's a torment. I know that because I had a really crazy abusive relationship, and not only there was the grief of finding that guy was an abuser and I ended up at the hospital. He tortured me for a year because I think it was narcissist or something, some of those mental illnesses that are not very good for the other person. And he would go and put me on a roller coaster between I love you and I'm sorry and let's get together to you're the most terrible person on earth. I don't want to see you. So there is a hope and a crash, a hope and a crash. And maybe a few of them within 24 hours with like endless texts. It was really, really, really torturing me actually, until I broke the pattern. And the way I healed from that is when I took responsibility for being involved in the relationship and went from I'm his victim to I was a willing participate. I'm not a victim. And the way I took my responsibility was to call and say, "Hey, I'm sorry." And I was in a seminar, and that's what they offered us to do, to actually call that person, and everything in me screamed, "No, don't do that. He's the bad one. You have the evidence on your body and in your scarred mind and soul that of what happened there and the torture that you've been through. Why do you have to ask for forgiveness?" And but the moment I did that, and I called him, and in the beginning it was just like, "You're a bad person," whatever mean things he said. And then toward the end, he actually said something nice. And when he said something nice, I broke down in tears. And it was the most liberating moment for me. Because after that, and that didn't happen the first year, it happened, I think, a year and a half or 2 years after that relationship, where I was able to go and do this whole process, because it takes time to actually figure out where you are in life and who you are, because your identity all of a sudden changes. You're not the same person as you were with the other person, or like the perceived future is completely different. Um, so taking the responsibility for me was the most liberating thing. Even though some people will not agree with me and say you should never ask for forgiveness, but I needed it for myself, not for him.
Sure. Oh, thanks for sharing that. And forgiveness is so incredibly personal. It's like grief itself. I actually explore forgiveness in my book, which is because it is such a common experience that people have no matter what has brought on the ambiguous grief. And I'm glad you mentioned a friend and you mentioned your relationship. Even a relationship that was abusive can still create space for this grief. And what I found in my research is that it isn't just it's not just a divorce, like in my experience, or a romantic relationship that you described that can activate ambiguous grief, but many experiences where a loved one has changed, the relationship dynamic has changed as it once was, can activate ambiguous grief. And just some of those experiences, for example, would be dementia or Alzheimer's, any kind of cognitive decline. Addiction was a really big one that I found, where whether it is a person whose child has become addicted or to a behavior or to a substance, or a friend, a spouse, a parent, a sibling, a best friend. Everybody can be impacted by when the relationship changes. Incarceration was another one. I actually worked with a woman who talked about the shame of her husband's incarceration was so heavy for her that she was grateful for COVID, because being in lockdown was a cover for her, not to have to share where he was or why he wasn't around. She wasn't sure what she was going to do. And she was hoping it would be extended, the lockdown would be extended so that his lockdown would not be revealed, right? So we don't think about grieving somebody to incarceration because they're still living, but they are not in the relationship as they once were, right? They can't be. Traumatic brain injury is another one, any kind of identity change, and estrangement is a really prevalent activator for ambiguous grief. And this is, somebody just kind of ghosting you, somebody saying,
Oh
I'm
my
not
God,
interested in being in a relationship
I
with you
don't like
anymore.
when people do that.
Right.
Why
And
can't
if
you
it's a
just be
relationship,
upfront with me? Just let me know what's
Mhm.
going on. Oh, I don't like
Right.
that.
Oh, and there's a whole host of reasons, right? And so what do we do with it? Do we continue to, as you say, in your experience, do we be a victim? Do we identify as a victim and say, well, they're a horrible person because they won't tell me why they won't be my friend, right? Or whatever the case may be. Or as you did, do we accept it? right? And some people I have found they may have trouble taking such responsibility as you did, and saying, I didn't cause this, and kind of letting that go. But you didn't cause it. Absolutely not. But you are responsible for your healing, right? And how are you helping your own healing?
Yeah, and then looking back, like I was responsible for, wanting love so much that I would ignore all the red flags. I was responsible for not taking care of myself. I was responsible for not knowing my boundaries and allowing them to be crossed, because it doesn't start like, it's not like an abusive relationship starts and all of a sudden like, hi, I'm your abuser, let's have fun together. It doesn't start like that. It's like the frog in the boiling water. If you put a frog in boiling water, it will jump. You'll know it's bad for it. But if you put it in cold water, you turn on the heat slowly, it will stay there until it dies. Unfortunately, I didn't die. If I stay there longer, maybe possible, but it doesn't start like that. The way it started for me is that there was a very strong attraction. He was very handsome and extremely intelligent, really good with his words, and he told me everything I wanted to hear. I was a goddess put on a pedestal. We planned our life together and our retirement together. Like everything was so beautiful. Yes, that's his part of the manipulation, but I played along because I wanted to be a part of that fairy tale. And right, that's what this is the part of my responsibility within it. Doesn't mean that I'm taking everything on myself. Yeah, what he did was just bad. And I was a willing participate.
Yeah. And some people I can imagine, I know will say, well, why are you grieving? He was a jerk. He was horrible to you. Why would you grieve that? Right. But the reality is, and you just said it, is it didn't start that way. In my own case, at the end of my marriage, I didn't know our marriage was in trouble. I loved my marriage and learned that my marriage wasn't what I thought it was.
How did you learn about it? All of a sudden, he gets up in the morning and said, "I'm going by." After how many years?
No. It was, and I write about it to give context. I one morning learned through, it looks like chance. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in chance. It was divinely timed. And I discovered emails that showed that my marriage wasn't what I believed it to be. And having a family and terrific children, it was an absolute shock. It was being put in boiling water, right? I had no even hint. And so people can get angry on our behalf and say, why would you grieve knowing what you know now? When you look back and see that there was no physical abuse, but there was integrity abuse in my marriage. And in your case, physical abuse. So people will say, why would you grieve that? But the reality is grief is equal and proportionate to the love. And you didn't fall in love with somebody who started abusing you emotionally, physically, financially, integrally, however that person is abusing you. It doesn't happen first, right? The love happens first. And then as the rest is revealed. So when grief happens, when you're grieving, wherever there is deep grief, there was deep love. When our Starbucks barista transfers, or our mail carrier is assigned to a different route, we're probably not grieving that, even if we see them every day, right? But it is those relationships that we build and nurture and that we care about that are the spring in which the love comes, right? And that love is what is grieved when the relationship is no longer there. And so if we can learn to show up for ourselves and recognize, oh, I'm not just in a funk, or I'm not just sad. This is grief I'm experiencing, no matter who the relationship is, that's no longer there. We can learn to carry it with us. We can learn how to integrate it, how to feel it. And I believe that grief really is a transformative human experience that is a portal to our greatest and highest self, if we allow it. And the problem is we're so grief phobic in our society that we don't allow it. We don't talk about it.
Grief is like it's like the metamorphosis of a butterfly, of a caterpillar inside the cocoon. And we need to go through that and break through that cocoon on our own in order to literally spread our wings. And if somebody comes and try to even open the cocoon, that butterfly will never fly a day in its life. So we need to go through that. We need to go through.
We have to do it for ourselves. That's right.
Our soul chose that, and we can rise up or try to avoid and never get the lesson and just have it as a repetitive pattern. Like you don't know me. I'm happily married to a really amazing man, and actually when I look back at that moment, for me it was like a gift with a bow on the bottom. I couldn't unpack it that moment, but now years later it brought me to who I am today, to even building this podcast for the last 8 years, and having incredible people like you, and sharing all this. I'm sure that something we share today can really touch the heart of someone and create a real transformation in their life, because you talked about being seen. And the first person we need to be seen by is ourselves. And when you have people like you who share this amazing information, and you come and you tell somebody, hey, you are grieving, and that's okay, and that person sees themselves, they can love and accept themselves more. And then their metamorphosis process is going to be so much more faster and more profound.
Yes, I think you're right. And it's something we have to work through. It's something we have to experience. And, grief isn't something that is here and then it's not, right? It's not something that we, are going to do these things in this order and then we'll go back to how we once were. No. It is like love, it is transformative. And we learn to integrate it, and we learn to carry it as a part of us, not as something ugly and hideous that we don't want to ever look at, or something so painful. It's something that is a normal and natural response to loss. That is what grief is. And you're right. The more we can honor ourselves and say, oh, that's what this is, the more we can see it in others and help one another. Because you're right, we can't go and, no friend could have come and opened your cocoon for you, right? But they could be around you, showing love, sending support.
Holding space, yes.
Holding space to say, you can do this. You can do this. This is what this is, and it's okay. And, I personally have learned about myself that I learned through contrast. I learn quickly through contrast. And so having an experience that I don't like or that doesn't feel aligned is for me a gift, because I'm able to say, oh, well, that's what I don't like. Now I can see more clearly what I do, what is for me, what is my path. And so grief is one of those things, though, that we want to turn off right away because it doesn't feel good, because it is awkward or uncomfortable, or depending on our family of origin or our culture, we might not have been witness to grief of our families. We might not have been permitted to grieve, right? And so we don't know how or what's okay. We only know what we've witnessed. And so, and for some, they haven't witnessed grief in their life. So when it is an experience that comes to them, they don't know how to handle it, right? So learning by contrast, and you kind of described it without saying as much, you're in a relationship now that is fulfilling and aligned with your soul. And you know that it's aligned because you had the relationship that was not, right? And so for people who are just going through grief, any of your listeners are just going through a really difficult time, being able to kind of look at it through the lens of contrast might be helpful, because yes, it is hard moving through it, and allowing people to hold space is a gift to them and to you.
Yes. I follow Abraham Hicks. I don't know if you're familiar, Esther Hicks. And they talk about your vortex, which is, I guess I can describe it as an energy field around you where everything you want is there, infinite possibilities of infinite timelines and infinite futures that you can tap into. And through experience contrast in life, through experience the darkness, you know what the light is. And you can be, I think the next level after forgiveness is being in such gratitude for yourself and gratitude for that situation and gratitude for that person that came and taught you that lesson. Nick Donald Walsh has this little book for kids that I love. It's called The Little Soul in the Sun. And it's a story about a soul wanting to come to earth to experience itself as forgiveness. And then another soul volunteers to dim it light and become really dark and show up in this world in order to teach that soul a lesson so it can experience itself as forgiveness. And I'm getting chill, like goosebumps just saying there. It's a beautiful book. It's going to be in the show notes. We have it. I read it to my little son. It's so profound. It's, some children books are really profound for adults and for kids as well. And yeah, when you're in gratitude, like, I guess but it's a few steps later, right? First you have to, why don't you tell me? Because you're the expert. What are the stages of grief?
Well, I don't know if I'm the expert, but I'm certainly sharing what I've discovered. Forgiveness is something that I've learned a lot about, and not in the way you might think. What I learned was, as much as our culture is grief averse, we are forgiveness champions. I would have people tell me in the very beginning, well, you have to forgive. You will not heal unless you forgive. So you may as well forgive now. And I take real umbrage with that.
That's premature.
It did not align with me then, and does not now. I personally, and I'm clear when I write about this, and when I talk about it, forgiveness is a good thing. Forgiveness is a great thing. It is a virtue in Catholicism. It is found around the world. People have been writing about forgiveness for millennia. I am not a hater of forgiveness. However, I am not a
So what are you of forgiveness?
I'm not an advocate either, because it isn't mine for one or the other. It's yours. It's each of ours individually, because I don't know what your soul is here to do, right? And so what I am, though, is I really believe that we feel so much pressure to forgive because we want to be a good person, or because society tells us, or because the etiquette books in the late 19th century, I found in my research, say that this is what a proper person does. The etiquette of this Victorian age said, this is what we do. Somebody harms you in any way, steps on your gown, splatters you with their carriage wheel, whatever it may be, you say, and they say sorry, you say it's okay. Well, that's such a transactional experience. we don't allow ourselves the actual feeling of hurt, anger, disappointment. And then we don't allow ourselves to actually feel real forgiveness. We just want to be a good person. And if you go to any sandbox today at a park, go watch kids. And I have 3 children. I am guilty of this. When they were young, you want your children to be invited back to the play date, or you want your children to build relationships. So you're in the park and playing, and somebody comes and takes your kid's toy. Oh, we might be quick to say, oh no, tell him it's okay, or tell her you're sorry. Well, why aren't we giving our children agency over
So true.
what that feels like?
I just did it yesterday.
It's not okay. This kid just took my toy again.
Yeah.
Why do I have to say it's okay? Why do I have to? It's not okay. That's a special toy to me. And so if we can advocate for our kids and not worry what the etiquette books say, but allow them, and we can teach them not to harbor anger, right? We can teach them to feel it and then to release it, and teach them to dialogue with one another on, that hurt my feelings, Orion, that you took my toy. Well, I want it. Well, it hurt my feelings and I don't want to share it with you. And there's no apology. That's not, and I call this, when we rush to forgive somebody without feeling it, I call it faux-giveness. F-A-U-X, fake. It is faux-giveness. And I actually wrote an article for Spirituality and Health magazine about the dangers of faux-giveness, because when we are forgiving and we don't feel the forgiveness, we are out of alignment with our own integrity. And there are physiological responses that happen. It increases our blood pressure. Our heart rate quickens. We might develop headaches. Our bodies respond if we're living in a state of perpetual forgiveness. Oh, I forgive you, I forgive you, I forgive you, but you really don't. You're only hurting yourself. And so instead of chasing forgiveness and looking for forgiveness because you want to be a good person, and I'm just going to say I forgive, instead let forgiveness find you. You don't need to go be in search of it. It will present if you leave that space.
When I was in that seminar, I was not expecting that exercise of forgiveness. It came to me, and I was not ready to do it until the very end, the very last day. Because I was like, I can't do it. It was, and I love what you're saying. It's about alignment. It's about feeling all your feelings and going through the process. And some people, it takes decades and decades until they forgive someone. And that's okay. And even if they don't, that's okay too. Whatever they want to do, like we're all sovereign people. We all do what's right for us. And we need to listen to our hearts first. And I think with forgiveness, it's like, it's about the intention of forgiveness. Me forgiving him was not to be a good girl. Me forgiving him was for me to let go of all this heaviness in my body and my lack of ability to date anybody else since that relationship. And the moment I did that, I was able to date again. So I think it's also the intention of forgiveness, where you're just like, you look inside and you're like, okay, my cup is full. I had enough. I'm ready to let go of this. Then it happens.
Right. And to your point, yeah, that may never come. And that's okay. As long as you're not ruminating in the pain of it all and wearing your victim cap, then you're poisoning yourself, right? They say forgiveness, anger held without forgiveness is your own poison. But again, just like grief is love, so too is, I relate forgiveness to the idea of love, because if I said to you, Orion, you need to go and call this person and tell them that you love them. And you're like, who? No, tell them you love them madly and deeply. Well, you can say that. You can say it and not feel it, right? And it wouldn't be true. So why do that? If you don't, And you know when you feel love, when you feel that inside of you, you know what that is for you. Oh, I love this person. My feelings are growing. Love rarely happens in a snap instant, right? With a romantic partner, say. This isn't a, parent-child bond. It's a romantic bond doesn't always happen at first sight. It rarely happens at first sight. And so just as you wouldn't tell somebody you love them because you think you should, even though you know you don't, or you're not sure, or all of the things, kind of check yourself with forgiveness in that same way. Oh, am I saying this because I feel like I should, because it's the right thing to do, because I don't want to hurt their feelings, because whatever. It's okay to not tell somebody you love them madly and deeply if you don't. And it's okay not to tell somebody that you forgive them, or even to tell yourself you forgive that person, because forgiveness can happen without the other person hearing you say that, right? You can call. In your case, you were invited to call and you met that. That felt okay to you. In many situations, it is not a good idea to reestablish contact with somebody that you have forgiven. I don't need to call my ex-spouse to say, hey, just want to let you know I forgive you. I don't need to do that but I can still feel forgiveness, but I don't need to make it ceremonial in any way, but for myself.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I call it the other F word. It's forgiveness is a hot button for a lot of people, but I invite you.
Yeah. Everything that you do that you do because it's a should is not a good thing to do.
There, put that on a coffee cup. That is, that's a great line to remember.
And also, if you look at language, like instead of I should do it, you can say I can do it, or I'm choosing to do it. And when you're choosing, when it's a choice, then it's a good thing. But when you do it, when you're doing anything because you should, I mean, that like you're stepping over your own boundaries, and it will cause you harm.
Right. An obligation, if you're doing it out of an obligation, to somebody else, that's often an invitation for resentment to start building.
And talking about forgiveness, like I have a lot of people I haven't forgiven in my life. Not a lot, um, a lot now. And when I say a lot, I'm Israeli, and October 7th happened, and women were brutally murdered, raped, dragged through Gaza. Babies were burned alive in ovens, and those were unprovoked citizens that were just in their sleep, and the horrors goes on and on. I don't want to even go into the gory details of what they did to small young children. I cannot forgive those people. I don't think anybody in my country will ever forgive those people. Like, how can you forgive somebody who does such atrocities? I'm not in a place to forgive. Like right now, Israel and Israelis and our soldiers, we're in a place of, it's not revenge. It's a war for being like for protecting our own children. Because if we're not going to go there and eliminate all this terrorist establishment and the city of tunnels that is under Gaza, that is full of explosive and very smart weapons, because they're saying out loud, if we can, we're going to do October 7th again. And their plan was actually bigger than 1,500 people. Their plan was, somehow there was a miscommunication between them and another terrorist organization. I didn't understand exactly. But they want to do it again. If you give them a chance, they'll do it again. So you can't be in like, oh, I forgive you, my brother, because throughout history we did it. There were so many agreements offering like Gaza has its own, government. We gave it, here, it's yours, take it. But you can't forgive somebody who just raises their kids from very young age to just like kill you. Like that's the, there was a story about this Palestinian lady, and she had some before this happens, a few years ago, where they had access to Israel back and forth until they're like, I mean, we have to put a fence on because we just don't want to have any more bombing happen. Um, so she came. She was treated in a hospital. Israeli doctors treat her with kindness and respect for 6 months. She came back a few months later with an explosive on her body, trying to um, to bomb the whole hospital. And when she was asked about it in jail, she said, I was dreaming about being a shaheed from a very young age as a girl. Like that was my dream." Um, and so I don't know how to have forgiveness for these people. I'm not there. I'm not there at all. I have zero tolerance and zero forgiveness for somebody who wants to destroy my family and my country. And from the river to the sea, um, there was never a Palestine state.
And I don't think you need to, Orion. I don't think you need to be, especially at this time, putting any pressure on yourself for forgiveness. And I'm not saying you are putting pressure, but what I learned from the October 7th attack was something that I wish we all knew, and that is this beautiful tradition of Shiva and bearing witness, right? Just like love needs to be witnessed, grief needs to be witnessed. And you sharing that story just now is bearing witness. And it is a tradition that has been part of Judaism for millennia. And it is a beautiful ritual that says, I see your grief, as you know. And when we can, and this was back to the beginning of our conversation here today, you know, I felt like I imagined this might be how a widow would feel, but nobody was here to witness. I had hundreds of people at my wedding celebrating our marriage, and I had very, 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 very few witnessing my grief and over the end of that marriage. But that's what we need. That's what grievers need. We need people. We need to tell our stories. We need to speak of the love and our loss. And we need people to sit Shiva and hear us.
Yeah. And for people who doesn't know, Shiva is after a loved one dies, you sit for 7 days. You don't leave your home, and people come and visit you and comfort you and bring you food. And it's a big mitzvah. Mitzvah means a good deed, to come and comfort even a stranger. Yeah, yeah. I can say that, like, as an American Israeli, I have a very strong American identity and also a very strong Israeli identity. I am totally, like, have been going through a tremendous grief in the last 2 months. And not only that, there is also the grief of, like, seeing all the anti-Semitism in a country that I thought was, like, so cool. And I never thought, like, anti-Semitism, that's like World War II, those are Holocaust times. And all of a sudden you see it on the streets. It's like, whoa, this is also, it's another type of grief where, like how can people twist what's happened? And in Yale University, they're saying it's okay to the call to have that call for the genocide of Jews. Like, so there is, I guess I am dealing with that type of grief. It's not my personal grief, but it's like a national grief, and it's a grief as being, like, being Jewish, and I've never felt so Jewish until all those calls for anti-Semitism. I love everybody equally. I have friends from Jordan. I have friends from Syria. I have friends from, like, I went in Israel. Like, my best friend when I lived in Jaffa was an Arab Israeli. Like, but when you see so much hate, that brings your identity out, and that brings a lot of grief. So I know we don't have much time, but maybe you can give me some tools to deal with all this.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. It is grief, because it's grief rooted in fear, right? Because this isn't a grief that, you experience when love is intact, which, so if your grandmother has died, you can grieve and be filled with love at the same time. And so, and oh, how wonderful to have that kind of grief, really. To have grief that is rooted, born from fear is scary. It's difficult. It's gnarled and it's nuanced. It's a different kind of grief. Added another layer to this. This is grief that not everybody feels. In this way, it's ambiguous because
It's very
sure,
ambiguous. Yes, I went
Right.
to a mastermind a week after October 7th.
Mhm.
I fainted at the airport because of stress. And I went there and like everybody had their normal life and nobody understood what I was going through. It's very, it isolates you to your like small community, small identity, where I'm this type of person that loves to feel, everybody's equal. I love oneness. I love expansion. We're all in it together. And all of a sudden you feel kind of isolated in your grief.
Absolutely. And that's something called disenfranchised grief, where it isn't recognized or it isn't validated. So some people might look at your grief and say, oh, she's being dramatic, or I don't know why she's grieving about this or talking about this. She didn't have any loved ones impacted by the attack. Nobody died from her family. I mean, and I say this glibly, but I don't feel that way. These are narratives that people might bring about the disenfranchised grief. That's why you're not feeling arms around you.
But a side note, there is no one family in Israel that weren't affected.
This is what I'm saying, right? Of course you're impacted. And really, we're all impacted if we understand what happened. I am not Jewish. I understand what happened. I am impacted. My friends are deeply impacted, and I care about my friends. And so, but yet, if there is not a direct link, oh, Orion didn't have anybody die from her family, so why is she behaving this way? This is what people will think, and that is why your grief is disenfranchised, because they're connecting it incorrectly, right? They're not. And again, and I giving everybody the benefit of the doubt, giving grace here.
But also there is a lot of fear because, they're still sending rockets to Israel, right? And we have the Iron Dome.
Oh, it's far from over, right?
But in like half a mile near my mom's house, there was a rocket that fell, and my sister was driving to a New Year's party, and exactly at 12, it was an open field, and she actually saw the rockets in the sky. It actually happened to her twice. So yeah, we're all impacted.
Absolutely. And this is where, grief and any life experience that is out of the ordinary to what we're expecting puts us at risk for diagnoses such as PTSD, right? This is a traumatic event. That's why you fainted at the airport. Your body, your physiology is trying to process and comprehend. And again, when that deep sense of grief you're feeling is rooted in fear, I feel so much compassion, because it is so hard.
Thank you. I actually really feel seen by you. I feel you. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this with all of us and allowing me to bear witness in some small way and allowing the rest of us to bear witness. And if there is one thing we can do for each other to transform grief, is to bear witness and allow others to grieve openly and honestly. I see you. And I see your grief.
Well, I really appreciate you. You're a very kind soul, and they say that you can look at people's faces and you can see who they are. And when I look at your face, regardless of holding the hands of so many people and dealing with like the worst terrible thing in life, which is grief, like your face, like it looks like you're like a person that loves life and have so much joy inside, and so much empathy and so much care. And I'm very happy. It's a good reminder that there are a lot of really amazing people in the world, and even in the most, we see life and we can focus on what's dark, but in this concept of the universe and yin yang and light versus darkness, there's a lot of darkness, and there's also a lot of light, and a lot of people like you, um, that are really good people and just bringing more light and more care and more love into the world. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And thank you for having me in this discussion, and for all the conversations you're bringing to Stellar Life podcast. And I hope we stay in touch, Orion.
Yes,
Much love to
me
you.
too, me too. Before we say goodbye, two things really quickly. What are your three top tips to living a stellar life, and where can people find you?
Three top tips to live a stellar life. One is to be in alignment with yourself always. Number two is to figure out who you are. Number three is to allow yourself to give love and receive love.
Amen for that.
Even when it's hard.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And people can find me online on Instagram. I'm Steffing through, STEPHING_THRU on Instagram, or my website is StephanieSarazin.com.
Thank you. And what's the name of your book?
My book is Soulbroken, a guide for your journey through ambiguous grief.
Beautiful. And they can get it anywhere, I guess.
Anywhere books are sold. Yes. Thank you.
Anywhere books are sold. Great. Perfect.
Anywhere books are sold. I'm grateful.
Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing this wisdom. Thank you for allowing me to be open and vulnerable with you, and with our listeners, and sharing my heart, and being witnessed and being seen by someone who can hold space like the way you do. And I'm sure you help a lot of people. Yes, everybody that needs help, get the book or contact Stephanie, because she's a gem.
It's an honor. It's an
Very
honor.
special.
Thank you, Orion.
Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you, listeners. Remember to be in alignment with yourself, figure out who you are, allow yourself to give and receive love, and have a stellar life. This is Orion. Till next time.